The views expressed on Science for the People are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
This week on Science for the People, we'll meet the authors of 3 big books that use stunning images to tell stories about the history of science. Welcome to Science for the People. I'm Desiree Schell, and I'm joined by Dr. Paul Taylor, who has worked in the Natural History Museum's Earth Sciences Department for more than 35 years. His research focuses on fossils and living bryozoans, especially their evolution and ecology, and he's published more than 300 scientific papers about them and other aspects of natural history, including fossil folklore. He's here to talk about his book, A History of Life in 100 Fossils. Welcome, Paul.
Hi.
Now, first off, people can't see the book, which is unfortunate because it is absolutely gorgeous. So where did the photos come from?
Well, the majority of them were actually taken of specimens that are in my museum, the Natural History Museum in London, and they were taken by, we have a very good photographer here called Harry Taylor. He's no relation of mine at all, but I wish he was because he could take photographs of my family. He's brilliant. He is extremely good. You wouldn't believe how scrappy some of the specimens actually appear in real life, and he's brought them to vivid technicolor with his pictures, and they're really beautiful.
They really are. I'm wondering about the book's format as well. Why did you decide on that?
Well, we were inspired by a book which some people may have read already. It was published a few years ago by the director of the British Museum in Bloomsbury. So that's the Museum of Antiquities. It's a book called A History of the World in 100 Objects. This is by the guy who's called Neil McGregor. And I was walking on the beach in Panama City with my co-author a few years ago. We were talking about McGregor's book, and we thought this would be a really good format to transfer to do a book on fossils, A History of Life in 100 Fossils. And when I got back, I approached the publications people at the Natural History Museum. They thought it was a great idea. They in turn approached the Smithsonian Institution, who are our co-publishers. They thought it was a good idea, so off we went.
Well, and how did you choose which fossils to include?
That was quite difficult. We had a lot of criteria in our mind. We wanted the book to give a reasonable picture of how life has changed through Earth since the earliest fossils. We also wanted to include fossils which were attractive. Some fossils tend to be grey objects on slightly darker grey backgrounds and really are almost impossible to illustrate and make look attractive. We also wanted fossils that were landmarks in some way, like the first bird, Archaeopteryx, or that illustrated principles of evolution, such as punctuated equilibrium. That's a theory of the way evolution proceeds in terms of having short, sharp bursts of change and then periods of stasis or very little change. We were also mindful of the fact that we should try and be even-handed, so although both Aaron O'Day, my co-author, and I are specialists on bryozoans, we only have one bryozoan in the book, whereas we have a lot more dinosaurs, naturally.
Well, are the images also in evolutionary order?
They're more or less in time order, yes. So we start out with the oldest fossils at the beginning and work up right to the last ancestor in the lineage leading to modern man. So yes, they are pretty much that way. There's a slight little bit of shuffling around in a few places, but generally speaking, yes.
Well, let's begin at the beginning. Pre-Cambrian Earth. What are your favorite fossils from that period?
Okay, well, I should just say the Precambrian is a vast interval of geological time. Right from the beginning of the Earth, which was around 4,600 million years ago, up until about 550 million years ago. So it's a vast interval of time, but there are not so many fossils. And most of the fossils that we actually have in the Precambrian are of tiny little microbial organisms, like bacteria, basically. And the first one that we have in the book has particular interest for me because it's a fossil that was described by William Schopf, or Bill Schopf, who is a professor at UCLA, Los Angeles, in 1993. And at the time that he was working on this fossil, he was on sabbatical in the Natural History Museum, and he was living in the room right next door to me. So I had a lot to do with him and a lot of contact with him at the time. And this is actually an example of what is thought to be the world's oldest fossils. And these are tiny little microbes, just a few microns, tens of microns in size, from the apex chert in Western Australia. They're believed to be round about 3.5 billion years old. And they don't look particularly spectacular, but of course they are of immense interest.
I think that's the way. Well,
yes.
I was actually wondering about the red stromatolite fossil.
That's rather more spectacular. So,
well, it's prettier, but it's also arguably one of the most important organisms to have ever existed. So there's that.
Yes. Well, a stromatolite is not really in itself an organism. What a stromatolite is a micro-community or community of microbial organisms that builds up layered masses of sediment. And the particular one in the book is really beautiful because it's very red in colour. It's very rich in iron. And at that time in the world's oceans, there was an awful lot of iron around. And that got trapped in this microbial mat as it was gradually building up on the seabed.
So why were these organisms so important in evolutionary history?
Well, they were the stromatolites and the stromatolite building organisms, of which you had a whole community of different bacteria and cyanobacteria and archaeobacteria. These were very important in really setting the scene for what happened later on. They, in particular, many of them were photosynthetic, so they introduced oxygen into the waters and hence into the atmosphere. So they really set the scene for more complex animals and plants that appeared later.
Okay, let's move to the Paleozoic era. Before I give you a chance to talk about your favorite, it's my show. So I really want to point out one that I love. It's an image of a trilobite. It's particularly striking, mainly because of its eyes.
We actually have two trilobites in the book, but the one that you mean is a really nice one, which has these tower-like eyes. Trilobites are very interesting. They're an extinct group of arthropods, so roughly closely related to things like modern-day crustaceans, crabs and the like, but completely extinct. And they had, the great majority of them actually had well-developed eyes. And the eyes are preserved because the lenses in the eyes of trilobites are made of a mineral called calcite. And calcite is very easily fossilizable. So whereas the lenses of human eyes, for instance, would not preserve as fossils normally, the lenses of trilobite eyes made of this mineral are routinely preserved as fossils. So we can learn a lot about the vision of trilobites.
It says in the book that there are about 500 lenses on each eye, and you can see almost every lens in this image.
Yes, they have compound eyes like modern insects. And yes, the lenses are each polygonal, or really hexagonal, and they're arranged in a series of columns along these surfaces of the eyes. And actually, the eyes are pointing outwards. So the trilobite was pretty good at seeing what was coming towards it from the front, the sides, and the back, but didn't really look upwards. It was living on the seabed, and it couldn't see what was above it very well.
Well, I'd also like to point out that as with many of the images in this book, it is the stuff of nightmares.
Yes, luckily it's quite small.
Horrible. It's horrible.
But it's rather small, so I don't think you'd need to worry too much about it attacking you, unlike some of the larger creatures.
This is Science for the People, and I'm talking to Paul Taylor about his book, A History of Life in 100 Fossils. So would you like to talk about the Mesozoic era, or did you have more from the Paleozoic era? Because I wouldn't want to not let you talk about something that's your favorite fossil.
Maybe I'll talk about something which provides a link into the Mesozoic. On one of the spreads of the book, we have a rather nice picture of a group of animals called blastoids. Blastoids are echinoderms, and they are related to modern starfishes and modern sea urchins, but are a group which, like the trilobites, are no longer with us. And like the trilobites, the last of the blastoids lived about 250 million years ago. And at that time, there was a mass extinction, and a huge proportion of the animals and plants that lived on the Earth, both on the land surface and in the seas, became extinct. And in some cases, entire, not just single species, but in some places, entire groups met their demise. And trilobites were one, and blastoids were another.
Well, now we should mention the Archaeopteryx, because you already did, and I love it. And particularly because the fossil that is pictured is one that we actually, many of us have already seen. Yes,
you may have seen this picture in other books and also perhaps on display in the Natural History Museum in London. This is one of only about a dozen well-preserved Archaeopteryx specimens known from anywhere in the world. An Archaeopteryx is a bird, and most people believe it to be the earliest known bird. It's about 147 million years old, and it's collected from a place called Solnhofen in Bavaria, in southern Germany. And it's very remarkable because it has very clear impressions of the feathers, including a tail with feathers on it, which the tail is bony. It has the vertebral column goes down into the tail, and the feathers are attached to that, which is something we don't find in modern birds, which have very short or no tails at all.
Well, I was wondering, it says in the book that Archaeopteryx was considered to be the perfect evolutionary missing link.
Yes.
Why was that?
Well, it has some features which are like those of reptiles, and in particular of some dinosaurs. And it has other features which are typical of birds, like the feathers. It has a wishbone like a bird. It has teeth, rather like a reptile, rather like some of the dinosaurs that were its forerunners. And the bony tail, which is more dinosaurian than it is bird-like. So it was considered to be a good example of missing link, and indeed Huxley, who was often known as Darwin's bulldog, who was championing the theory of evolution for Darwin, he took up Archaeopteryx a lot and promoted this as an example. At the time that Darwin wrote The Origin of Species in 1859, Archaeopteryx was not known. Darwin would dearly love to have known about it. It was only published a couple of years later. But it would have been marvellous if he had known about it. I'm sure he would have highlighted it very much in the book.
Now, I'm very curious. At this point in your career, do you hate the words missing link, or do you just find them problematic?
I think there is a tendency, or there has been a tendency amongst some paleontologists to try and fit every single fossil into a lineage leading up to some modern organism and consider it as a missing link. But, of course, evolution is very complex. It's a tree. It's not a single line. And an awful lot of the fossils we get are dead ends. They are in no way are they missing links. And actually, to recognize something which is strictly speaking a missing link between two species is really very hard to do. The methods of doing that are a little bit suspect. So we can never really say that things are absolutely the missing link, or even a missing link. But it's sort of quite useful in that the general idea that there are things out there in the fossil record that provide some kind of bridge between the animals and plants that we see today, different types of animals and plants we see today. That is quite useful, that there are things in the fossil record that bridge gaps that otherwise we might not be able to know about.
Okay, it's your turn. What is your favorite from this era?
Certainly one of my favorites is an ammonite fossil, and it's a fossil called Pictonia bailey. It's interesting because the specimen that's in the book is one that we have here in the Natural History Museum. It forms part of the collection of a geologist called William Smith. This is a very important year for William Smith. It's the 200th anniversary of the publication of William Smith's geological map. He was the first person anywhere in the world to produce a nationwide geological map. So in 1850, he produced this wonderful map that has England, Wales, and the southern parts of Scotland with all the geological strata delineated in different colours, as we have in modern geological maps. And the reason that William Smith was able to recognise the strata and trace them across country across places where there may be no rocks exposed on the surface, So he was going from one quarry to another one that might be many miles away. But he could recognize that it was the same level, the same stratum, the same bed by the fossils that were contained in it. And this Pictonia bailey is one of the fossils that he found in a deposit called the Kimmeridge clay. And he was able to correlate, to recognize strata of the same level across the country using this kind of fossil.
Okay, we have a very few minutes left to cover the entire Cenozoic era. I know. So which ones would you like to point out?
A thing that I really like is the giant moa. Moas are an extinct group of birds. They became extinct in historical times, which inhabited New Zealand. So they're related to the emus and the ostriches, basically, giant flightless birds. And we have a lot of very nice specimens here in the collection. The one in the book shows the lower leg and the toe bones of a really magnificent specimen that we have in the collection. One of the things that's very interesting to me about the moa is, although they're extinct in New Zealand, if you go to New Zealand and look at the vegetation, you will see some plants still living which have moa-resistant adaptations. So there is a plant called the lancewood, which grows up as rather an unappetizing, shrubby tree or bush with very long strap-like leaves until it gets to a particular height above which the moa could not graze. When it gets to that height, it suddenly flourishes into a proper fully fledged tree with lots of nice nutritious leaves. So it's showing us that even today, for some of these recently extinct species, some modern species retain adaptations that were evolved in order to, in this case, to counteract being eaten by the moa bird.
If I can intrude again, I really want to make sure that we get your comment about the Laetoli footprints, because I think that's my favorite photograph.
So the Laetoli footprints were discovered in Tanzania in 1976 and excavated by Mary Leakey, who was a very famous anthropologist. So these are footprints of some ancestors or close relatives of modern man, probably in the order of 4 or 5 million years old. They show some individuals that were walking across some damp ashes, and they impressed their feet into the surface of the ash. Later on, the ash hardened, dried up and hardened, and was then buried beneath further layers of ash until it was excavated by Mary Leakey. They show very clearly that these individuals were bipedal. They were walking upright on 2 feet, not on all 4 limbs like most modern apes. And they also, you can work out things like the gait, the stride length and all this kind of stuff. These actually are an example, and we have several in the book, of a trace fossil. So we don't actually have the bones or the teeth of these animals. All we have is the impression in the sediment. It's a particular kind of fossil called a trace fossil. It seems as though there was a smaller and a larger individual, possibly a male and a female, and that they were walking very close to one another, maybe even arm in arm. And then there's a smaller individual carrying something heavy on the side, possibly a child. So there's quite a lot that you could actually try to infer from this. Maybe this was a family is buried. This, as I said earlier, these footprints are actually in damp ash, and they're buried by further layers of ash. Maybe they were trying to escape from an erupting volcano. We just don't know.
No, although that could possibly be considered rampant speculation, I very much like it. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, Paul, for being here.
Okay, it's a pleasure.
And that was Paul Taylor, co-author of the book, A History of Life in 100 Fossils. And you should know that it is coming out in paperback later this year. And we've linked to it and Paul on our website at scienceforthepeople.ca.
Science for the People is a weekly radio show exploring everyday life from a scientific perspective. To find out where Science for the People airs near you, or to listen to past episodes, check out our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. You'll also find links to connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Google+, or to subscribe to the podcast in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Science for the People. I'm Rochelle Saunders. With me is Julie Halls. Julie has worked at the National Archives for more than 6 years and is the records specialist for registered designs. She's studying for a PhD on 19th century registered designs at Birkbeck College, University of London, and has written a book about some of the more eccentric designs, Inventions that didn't change the world. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you.
So maybe we should start by what the book is. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
This is the first time most people will have been able to see these totally unique designs. Not everyone could get to the National Archives to see the original documents, which are in any case huge and very difficult to handle. But they're designs that were registered for copyright under the 1843 Utility Designs Act, which gave people the opportunity to copyright designs, which was much quicker and cheaper than the complicated and expensive patent system. But this inspired all sorts of amateur inventors as well as professionals to copyright their designs. And to do this, they had to submit 2 copies to the Designs Registry. And 1 copy was pasted into an enormous leather-bound volume. And they're the records that we now have at the National Archives. They've been virtually unseen, really, except for a few determined researchers for the last 150 years or so. So this is really a chance for people to see them for the first time.
It seems like in this era, especially in Great Britain, where the Industrial Revolutions were really underway, what was it about this era that spurred so much interest in inventing? It seems like you say there were a lot of amateur inventors really getting interested in this kind of work.
It was a period when people were really excited about all the huge technological advances being made, like the steam engine, railways and electric telegraph. And Britain was a great manufacturing and trading nation. There was an enormous pride in that, and men like George Stephenson and Isambard Kingdom Brunel were national heroes. And this generated a widespread fascination with the way things worked, much more so than we seem to have today. And there was really a culture of wanting to learn as well as a strong belief in making your way in the world. And ordinary people attended lectures on technology and subscribed to magazines and journals that described how inventions worked. And all this gave rise to a culture that encouraged would-be inventors to see if they could make a success of their own ideas. And although many of the ones featured in this book seem a bit misguided now, they reflect the enthusiasm of the period.
It's really interesting. The word inventions, it sort of conjures up big devices with lots of cogs and wheels and mechanics. But what was really cool about this book is there's a lot of kind of little handheld gadgets or pieces that would slip sometimes unobtrusively into everyday life. And a lot of these seem a bit more novel than necessarily practical.
Yes, I think this was partly because of the huge expansion of the Victorian middle classes, which meant that there was a large section of society with more disposable income than ever before. They had money to spend, and at the same time, they were very keen on gadgets, and especially items with multiple functions. And at the same time, middle-class men had really been identified by advertisers as an untapped market, and they seemed to have a particular interest in these gadgets. So we see things with multiple functions, like the design for a cigar-holding pencil case knife, which has a snappy title, and the cigar cane, which allowed you to store your cigars inside a cane, so that you didn't have to carry a cigar box around. They were really very interested in novelties.
It's interesting. The title of this collection in this book is Inventions That Didn't Change the World. But a lot of world-changing inventions happened in the same era. And there were a lot of ways the world itself was changing. And it's interesting how some of the inventions we see in this book kind of parallel or tell us a little bit about what was going on in that period.
Yes, and as I said, a lot of the population had more disposable income than ever before. And there was a great surge in interest in the home, which was seen as a refuge from industry and the centre of family life. And we see a lot of gadgets for the home, like prototype dishwashers and accessories for the bathroom, which was actually still a new room in the house. And the area of medicine is very interesting because we see inventions that reflect the huge progress that was being made, like inhalers for administering anaesthetic. And at the same time, old traditional forms of medicine like bloodletting still persisted. So we see registrations for objects like artificial leeches, which really sort of reflect the previous era. And then there are items that reflect new ways of working, like there are numerous designs for types of alarm clock, which was kind of a new thing that hadn't been needed before when people just got up with the sunrise.
You mentioned artificial leeches. This one really surprised me when I found it in the book. I just assumed that leeches were really common and we wouldn't need to invent something to do their job. Is that not accurate?
Well, bloodletting was still very widely practiced, and an imbalance of bodily fluids or humours was thought to be responsible for a range of ailments. And it was thought that inflammations were caused by an excess of blood. So leeches were literally used to treat everything from headaches to prostate problems. And this actually resulted in what was referred to as a mania for leeches, and their overuse resulted in a shortage. And at the same time, people started to become more squeamish about their use. I mean, they were actually used inside the body, attached to pieces of string to stop them breaking loose. So it's understandable that an artificial leech might seem a more attractive option. And then so there are several registrations for different types of artificial leech.
Now that you put it that way, it does seem like a better option.
Absolutely.
How did you pick the inventions to feature in this book? Because I can imagine in that big leather-bound book that you have at the archives that there are many, many, many more than we see here.
Yes, just for the 40-year period covered by this particular act, there are about 9,000. And quite a few of them are relatively sensible inventions that we probably would have seen, illustrated before. It's really these more quirky ones that we focused on for the book. But yes, it was quite difficult to make the decision, and a lot of quite mad inventions had to be left out. But we tried to choose ones that had a social history attached to them, however eccentric they might seem.
So this book is divided into sort of sections based on some of the social changes that were happening during the period, and it helps us kind of spot the patterns in the inventions. Can you tell us a little bit about what these designs and the ideas that they reflect tell us about what it was like to live in this time and place?
Well, I think, again, as I was saying before, the inventions reflect new ways of working, and one particularly notable one was the growth of the lower middle class. And the clerks in particular became a huge new workforce sector. And they had quite a hard time because they were very poorly paid in general, and they often earned less than a manual worker might earn. But they were expected to look very respectable in their job, and they always had to wear a white shirt, black coat and top hat. And it was very difficult for them to afford it. And so we see a lot of items like shirt fronts, which were just sort of used to cover up dirty or scruffy shirts, or a shirt that wasn't white, and collars that can be attached, made of celluloid and other materials like that. And we see other money-saving things like reversible trousers, which had a different colour on each side, so it saved having to buy two different pairs. And the unheralded boot, which was a boot with a metal rotating heel, which made sure that the heel wore evenly all the way round and made it last longer. And this was really to cater for a new workforce.
You mentioned before about that there were quite a number of designs for different types of alarm clocks. So previously, I suppose people didn't really have to worry about getting up before the sun rose.
No, that's right. I mean, when agriculture was the main sector in the economy, they just got up with the dawn and worked until dusk. But with office work, people had to make sure they were up at a certain time, and so we see these new types of alarm clock. One of them is quite eccentric and actually involves having to tie a piece of tape to your arm or your leg, and a weight drops at the given time and tugs your arm or leg to wake you up in the morning. And there's another one which is powered by a spring system, so a candle burns down, and at a certain point a bell rings to wake the person up. The factory workers wouldn't so much have had this problem, because often a klaxon would go off in the factory, and as they all lived quite nearby, that would wake them up at a given time.
It was quite fascinating to go through this book, like you say, with the alarm clocks, the ingenious ways people had of getting around not having electricity, which I guess I knew, but when you see the inventions and some of the lengths they had to go to, like with the alarm clock, it really kind of hits home what life without electricity must have been like.
Yes, everything was very mechanical, and it's just amazing how ingenious the Victorians were, really.
It's also quite interesting as well to look through the book and find inventions from that time that we're now, I guess, reinventing. I'm thinking of the standing sitting desk, which was in the book.
I think that's the one that was actually made for shoemakers, so that they could sort of stand up and sit down and sort of be far more comfortable than they might otherwise have been. And yes, it does make you think perhaps it was a step on the way to all the ergonomic furniture we have today.
There also seems with this middle class to be a rise in household and gardening gadgets. I'm going to use the word gadget because some of these are definitely not practical. I'm thinking in particular of the knife and fork cleaner, which looks like it might take longer to do the washing up.
Yes, absolutely. There are quite a number of inventions which look so complicated that you think surely it would just be easier to do it the traditional way. Another one is the hair brushing machine, which looks amazingly huge and complicated, but long, luxuriant hair was considered a great asset for women, and they were advised to brush it at least 100 times a day. So evidently some of them found this too much of a strain, and so they invented a machine to do it for them, which we're told that by turning the handle, a greater velocity can be obtained than by using a hand brush. But it actually looks quite dangerous and will take up an awful lot of space in the bedroom, I think.
I was going to say, that one looks not entirely safe. I don't know that I would stick my hair in that machine.
No, I think you might regret it.
So I also want to talk about the lack of electricity. There's also a lot of concern around fire and flames, and also heating things requires non-electric opportunities. I'm thinking of the portable bed warmer in particular here, which looks like an incredibly dangerous thing to put in your bed sheets.
Yes, it really does. The issue of fire was a big problem in the 19th century. There tended to be fewer fires that affected large sections of city, and that was mainly because houses and public buildings were being built from less flammable materials. But the number of disastrous fires in individual buildings, like factories and places of entertainment and in the home, increased. And this was because of the use of gas and oil lamps and new technologies like boilers for heating water, which sometimes exploded, as did the new cooking stoves used in kitchens. But yes, when you look at the hair-raising inventions like the illuminated night clock, which was powered by a candle, and the portable bed warmer, which is basically an oil lamp that projects heat through what's described as a gauze chimney, and it's presumably intended to be placed underneath the bed. You think the heat would be minimal and the risk of a fire would be huge.
There's also quite a number of safety devices that you highlight in the book, both around the usage of candles and also escaping a building, and some of those look to be like it would be a fairly harrowing experience to use some of those.
Yes, one of them is a sort of very flimsy-looking object. It's a kind of flat pack thing that you open up, and somebody's supposed to be able to jump out of the window and land in this thing, but it looks extremely unreliable, to say the least. And a lot of them are so complicated. They're operated by ropes and pulleys, and the person has to get into a basket and be on the outside of the building and be lowered down. So I think you'd have to be pretty intrepid to get into one of those, really.
I suppose the fire behind you would probably encourage you, but just because these items were designed and invented, does that necessarily mean that they were sold and actually purchased and used?
It's very difficult for us to tell now, unless it's something that we actually can find in the literature of the time. It's difficult to know, but I suspect that a lot of these didn't get beyond the prototype. There are some that we know did come into production, and one example is the hand hard labour machine, which is a reminder of conditions in 19th century prisons. And unlike the other designs in the book, it was intended to produce rather than save work. And it was invented at a time when hard labour was introduced, partly as an alternative to the death penalty. And the hand hard labour machine had a crank, which could be worked by a prisoner alone in a cell, who might be in solitary confinement. And they had to complete 10,000 turns of the crank in a day. And warders could tighten it, making it harder to turn. And rather depressingly, this is something that really did catch on and was very widely used in British prisons at that time.
So it was really designed just to punish somebody. There was no practical purpose to it. It didn't create anything. It didn't crush anything. It didn't actually produce anything. Is that correct?
That's right. Whereas in the early days, hard labour meant doing something useful, like sort of building roads. Later on, it just became a completely pointless activity, and the idea was that it would encourage the habit of work in prisoners, but also that it would act as a deterrent. Well, it was referred to actually as the maniac-making system because it really drove people crazy to be in solitary confinement doing this completely pointless activity.
I can imagine. Was there a reason that the more practical version of hard labor was withdrawn as an option, or why did they stop using prisoner labor to actually build things?
I'm not really sure, but I think it was partly just to increase the punishment element, really, and the idea of solitary confinement really caught on at this time, and so I think it was tied in with that.
We were talking before about clothing, and when we cross clothing with gadgets, we mentioned the cigars in a cane, but there are a number of fascinating inventions surrounding top hats, which I love.
Yes, absolutely. Throughout the 19th century, no respectable man would go outside without wearing a top hat, particularly middle-class men. And so we see a lot of inventions around storage, but also other long-forgotten problems associated with wearing top hats, because they were actually quite hot and heavy, and since most men also wore hair oil at that time, quite an unpleasant atmosphere could build up inside the hat. And there are a number of designs for solutions to the problem, including the bona fide ventilating hat, which has a kind of grill system built into it, which is intended to carry off perspiration from the interior, as the description tells us. But we also see hats that can be sort of squashed down to fit under a table in front of you, and various sort of storage solutions, because they were pretty unwieldy objects to carry around.
Also, the hats were used to sometimes, or proposed to sometimes, store items related to the hat, such as a hat brush.
Yes, absolutely. There's also a design for keeping cigars actually inside your top hat. So yes, there's quite a few storage solutions within the hat itself.
That's interesting, because now that we talk about the general atmosphere of the hat space, as it were, keeping your cigars there, I'm not sure that's a good idea.
No, I'm not sure an aficionado would want to do that.
So we don't have a lot of time left, but I'm just wondering, looking through the book, did you have a favorite invention, one that really stood out to you and is sort of your the one you go back to all the time?
One of my favorite inventions is the flying or aerial machine for the Arctic regions, which looks really magical. And it's one of those designs that looks completely bizarre, but makes sense when you know what was going on at that period. Because the newspapers at that time were full of stories about Arctic exploration and the exploits of explorers. And in particular, there was a race to find a trade route through the Northwest Passage. And this was the subject of sensational news stories. And at the same time, a prize had been offered to find the lost expedition of Sir John Franklin, which disappeared while searching for the route. So the date of registration of this design in 1855 suggests the inventor thought he'd found a solution to navigating Arctic terrain, although in reality the first successful airship wasn't actually built until 40 years later. But this one really looks like something from a fantasy film. The text tells us that the machine is operated by treadles which turn the wheels, and there's a suspended room with beds for 3 people. And metal plates underneath, so it can be propelled along the ice. So it's quite a contraption.
Do you think the person who created that device or designed that device had been to the Arctic and knew the challenges, or do you just think they were looking at the news stories and kind of imagining what it would be like? Because it does seem to deal with some of the major issues.
It tries to deal with the major issues, but I think it's very unlikely that he'd ever actually been there, and I think it would probably have been completely useless, but as an object, the design itself is just absolutely amazing, and the description that goes with it is quite mind-boggling, really, and he'd really thought it through, but I don't think it would ever have actually got off the ground.
Julie, it's been wonderful to have you here, and it's a gorgeous book, really beautiful and really fascinating to read through. It opens the door to a time and a place, and anybody who likes sort of steampunk stuff will love looking at this and getting a taste of what some of the inventions actually look like.
Well, I'm pleased that you like it.
If you're looking for more information about Julie Halls or the inventions that didn't change the world, we have links to get you started on our website, which is scienceforthepeople.ca. We'll be right back with more Science for the People right after this.
Science for the People is a weekly radio show exploring everyday life from a scientific perspective. To find out where Science for the People airs near you, or to listen to past episodes, check out our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. You'll also find links to connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Google+, or to subscribe to the podcast in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
This is Science for the People, and I'm here now with Sylvia Sumira, an independent conservator specializing in globes and author of Globes, 400 Years of Exploration, Navigation, and Power. Welcome, Sylvia.
Hello.
Now, how did you get interested in globes?
Well, it was really a happy accident. I studied history of art at university and then became very interested in the conservation of works of art on paper, watercolours, prints and drawings. And so I did a postgraduate course in that. And in my final year, I saw an advert from the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich in London, and they were setting up a globe conservation programme, and they wanted somebody with experience in paper conservation. So I thought, well, that sounds interesting, and so I applied, and I really didn't know very much about globes at all at the time. So I went to a library and got a couple of books out about globes. There weren't very many books. And to my astonishment, I was offered the job. And that started me off, and I've been doing it ever since.
So now, what is it that you find so fascinating about them?
Well, I think there's a lot more to a globe than you might initially think. I mean, I think we all know that a globe is a map of the world. But in fact, celestial globes were actually made long before terrestrial globes because people could look up at the heavens. And so the idea of making a sphere of the heavens came before the idea of making a sphere of the earth. So globes started to be made in pairs of globes. You'd have a terrestrial and a celestial globe in the 16th century. And that was something that was really interesting. And just getting to know a little bit about what else globes had to show, rather than just the actual mapping of the stars or the mapping of the land and the seas. They're just infinitely fascinating. And I think today we just really don't appreciate how much information they contain or contained in the past. I think they're much simpler now than they used to be.
Well, I definitely understand the fascination, because when I received this book, a friend and I spent probably a good 2 hours with it and some wine, just poring over the pictures, and they are beautiful. So where do these images come from?
The book is actually based on the collection of globes at the British Library here in London. And so what I tried to do in the book is pull out beautiful globes that illustrate the way globes actually developed from when they were first made.
Do we know when the very first globe that showed the countries and such, when might that have been made?
We don't really know when the first terrestrial globe was made. There are references to a terrestrial globe being made in the ancient world, but it doesn't survive, and it's unlikely that it showed towns and countries in the way that we think of a globe today. The oldest surviving terrestrial globe was made in 1492 in Nuremberg, and it's a beautiful painted globe which shows the world as was known at the time. And of course, in 1492, that was the year Columbus set off from Europe, and so America had not yet been discovered. So in fact, it shows the known world in 1492, and at that time there was no America. So according to that globe, if you sailed west, you would hit Japan. And then, because that was really around that time, there was so much exploration going on, interest in the world, and people really wanted to know more and more about what was going on in other parts of the world. And then that was really when greater interest in maps became more apparent, and globes followed on from that. And so terrestrial globes started to be made in greater numbers.
Now, how would the makers of those globes have gotten the information to put on them?
From as many sources as they could find. Obviously, the maps that were available to them in their own countries, foreign explorers' accounts, overland travelers such as Marco Polo, they were used. Ancient maps such as the maps by Ptolemy, who was the kind of culmination of classical thought in the 2nd century AD. These maps had been rediscovered and printed for the first time around the end of the 15th century. Well, it was the Renaissance, so there was a kind of rediscovery of all these ancient texts and maps, and people plundered those really to use in their own map making and thought. So there were many, many sources, and of course there was a lot of intrigue as well in trying to find the latest maps from, say, the Spanish and the Portuguese, so that people could make maps and globes with the latest knowledge, which would obviously make them more commercially viable. So there was a lot of competition between map makers to produce the most beautiful and the most up-to-date maps from as many sources as they could possibly find. And of course, there was I think many maps were made up with a great deal of speculation. For example, if you look at a globe in the 18th century, and if you look at Africa, it is absolutely full of information right from the coastlines right to the middle of Central Africa. And of course, nobody had actually been there at that point, so there was no way they could really know what it was like. But nobody could disprove it was wrong. So a lot of this information was really just completely made up. And it was later on, in fact, Africa becomes rather blank in the middle. And in fact, globe makers want to actually be more accurate in what they are actually representing on a globe. And so they will actually label certain parts of the world as unknown parts, which indicates that they hadn't yet been explored.
Now, what would these globes have been used for? Were they actually practical items or educational or more decorative?
They were multifunctional in a way. They were definitely used for educational purposes because it was very easy to see the shape of countries on the world and the relationship between different countries and continents. And they were obviously also, they could also be very decorative, especially the large globes in ornate stands. They provided a very handsome focus to any room, any grand room in a palace, for example, or in a library. They always looked very good. smaller globes, when it came to using them on ships, we know that they were carried on ships, but whether they were actually used as a practical tool in navigation, I think it's a bit unlikely, because it'd be rather impractical to have a globe on the deck of a ship and to be using it in any practical way. However, having said that, there was no doubt that they could be used as a kind of demonstrational tool for navigators, or for teaching sailors, or just for showing sailors how latitude and longitude worked, and so on.
Now, how common would they have been at this point?
When printed globes started being made in the early 16th century, they were not very common at all. And in fact, it was really only fairly wealthy people who would be able to afford to buy them, educated wealthy people. But as time grew on, they became much more accessible to many more people. So but by the time we get to the 19th century, they were being made in much greater quantities and at a much cheaper price, so that many more people could actually afford to buy them. And in fact, geography became a subject that was taught at schools. So globes became available to school children. They became much more affordable. And that was aided by newer techniques in printing. For example, lithography, which was introduced at the end of the 18th century, enabled globes to be produced much more cheaply than they had been before. Globes were made as educational objects, but people tried to inject a bit of fun into them as well. So you get kind of puzzle globes and globes that you could cut out and put together. In my book, there are a couple of globes whereby you can cut them out and paste them together, so you actually have your own globe, but very, very inexpensive to buy, and containing up-to-date geographical information.
You're listening to Science for the People, and I'm joined by Sylvia Sumira, author of Globes. Now, we think of globes as being the large tabletop kind that you've mentioned, or the floor models that are beautiful but basically furniture. But there are a number of pocket globes in the book, and I love these. Can you talk about them?
Yes. I mean, pocket globes, they are really beautiful objects to look at. There's an English maker of globes, Joseph Moxon, and he really kick-started globe making in the 17th century, and he claims to be the inventor of the pocket globe. Now, a pocket globe, as the name would imply, is a small item that one could put in one's pocket. And he advertised them as being made portable for the pocket. So they tend to be around 3 inches in diameter, and the idea is that you have a little terrestrial globe which sits inside a case which is lined with the celestial globe gauze, a gore being one of the segments of printed paper that is pasted onto a globe. So you have a lovely little cosmos. So you have the terrestrial globe encased in a celestial sphere, and you could open it up and take out the terrestrial globe and hold it in your hand and look at the world. And then you could also look at the heavens, which encircled this beautiful little terrestrial globe. And there was a tradition of making pocket globes in England. So there was a succession of pocket globe makers. And other countries produced pocket globes too, but not in the same number as in England. There's a beautiful globe in the book by Johannes Hohmann, which is a German pocket globe.
That was my favorite one.
That is a really, really lovely little globe, yes. So that's a German pocket globe, but I think that's the only German pocket globe I know about. There are a couple of Dutch pocket globes, not actually in the book, but it's really a very English thing. And that tradition continued well into the 19th century.
Now, could you actually use those? Because the level of detail is beautiful, but also very, very tiny.
It's very tiny, and I think with any globe, the amount of information on it, well, it varies from globe to globe. So some globes contain, I would say, sparse amounts of information, whereas other globes, even tiny ones, contain quite an incredible amount of information. I think one of the globes illustrated in my book is a little globe by Newton, who's a well-known globe maker in the 19th century, and it's about 1.5 inches in diameter. But if you look at it, it does contain an incredible amount of information.
I completely blame you for making me wind up on eBay looking for pocket globes. You cannot find them, for reference, in case anybody else wants to go on a wild goose chase. The pocket globes are obviously my favorites. But which globes in your book are you most attracted to?
Well, I think one of my favorite globes is a globe by Willem Blau. It's a celestial globe from 1606, which is just such a pretty little globe. And in fact, it's I think it's the globe that's illustrated on the jacket of the book. It just has such lovely images of the constellations.
So is there anything else that you think people absolutely should know about the history of globes?
Well, as I said at the start of the interview, I think there's much more to globe, celestial or terrestrial, than you might initially think. They really deserve closer examination. They're not just maps of countries or the heavens. There's an awful lot more going on. I think when we look at a globe, it looks perfectly formed as this wonderful sphere with all the countries of the world and the stars and constellations laid out. In fact, making a globe was quite an elaborate process, and the technique that came to be used, it was it lasted for almost 400 years. It didn't change very much from the early 16th century. So basically, a globe is made in the traditional way, is 2 hemispheres of papier-mâché glued together with a central wooden pillar. And then this is turned in a mold and covered in a plaster skim. And then this is smoothed down, so it's very, very smooth. And then the paper gauze, which are the segments of paper, I think I've already explained, the segments of paper where the map is printed, are then pasted over this smooth plaster sphere. And it all, when you look at a globe, they generally look absolutely perfect. But it was actually very tricky to get all these segments of paper to line up exactly with each other, and so that you had no wrinkles or gaps in between these bits of paper. So the actual skill in making a globe was quite considerable, but it was something that all globe makers managed to master, so that you couldn't really tell the elaborate process that went into making a globe.
Do you know if anybody actually hand makes globes anymore?
There are 1 or 2 globe makers, I believe, making globes, not exactly in the traditional manner, in that they probably don't make plaster spheres now. They might use fiberglass spheres, but very few and far between. I think most of the globes people are familiar with now are plastic globes, but there are 1 or 2 people, I think, making globes.
That is definitely too bad, because as I said, these are not just educational pieces. These are absolutely works of art.
They are works of art, yes. As I say, the heyday of globe making was really from the 16th century to the 19th century. And some of the globes are really just beautiful, beautiful objects to look at.
Great to have you here, Sylvia.
It's been a great pleasure speaking to you.
And we've linked to Globes, 400 Years of Exploration, Navigation, and Power on our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. While you're there, you can listen to and comment on all of our past episodes. Click the links to connect with us on social media or subscribe to the show in iTunes. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week on Science for the People. Science for the People is recorded in Edmonton, Alberta. The show is produced by Rochelle Saunders. Ryan Bromsgrove is our promotions manager. Our social media manager is Chelsea Butler. K.O. Myers updates our website. Helen Quivalon is our publishing liaison. Ed Haynes is our guest coordinator. We get research help from Josh Whitten. The show is edited by K.O. Myers and Ryan Bromsgrove. Our theme song was written and recorded by Fractal Pattern, and its title is Binary Consequence. The show is hosted by Rochelle Saunders, Marie Claire Shanahan, and me, Desiree Schell.